Somewhere beneath the Syrian desert, archaeologists crawled into a tunnel sealed for nearly 700 years. What they found stopped them cold. 20 Roman soldiers stacked on top of each other in a space barely wide enough to stand. No sword wounds, no arrows, no signs of close combat. Just 20 men who dropped, all at once, in the dark. For decades, no one could explain it. Then a forensic analysis changed everything. Based on historical and archaeological records, what happened beneath Dura-Europos in 256 AD may be the earliest documented use of chemical warfare in human history. The question is, how did an ancient army turn an underground tunnel into a gas chamber? Nearly 2,000 years before the world thought such a thing was possible. The Syrian desert does not give up its secrets easily. For thousands of years, the ancient city of Dura-Europos sat buried beneath layers of sand and silence on a high cliff above the Euphrates River, forgotten by the world. Then in 1920, a British soldier stumbled across a painted wall while digging a military trench. What he found was the beginning of one of the most remarkable archaeological excavations of the 20th century. Between 1928 and 1937, teams from Yale University and the French Academy of Inscriptions worked the site season after season. What emerged from the desert sand was astonishing, a city frozen in time, preserved almost perfectly by the dry Syrian climate. Frescoes still vivid with colour. Religious buildings from multiple faiths standing side by side. The everyday objects of soldiers and merchants and priests, untouched for over 1,600 years. But it was not the artwork or the temples that would eventually capture the imagination of military historians. It was something far darker, found in a narrow tunnel beneath the western wall of the city. Excavators uncovered the skeletal remains of at least 19 Roman soldiers, along with one individual believed to be Persian, compressed into a space barely a metre wide. The bodies were stacked in a way that defied easy explanation. They had not been killed in open battle. They had not been executed in a line. They had died underground, in a place most men would never willingly enter, and something had killed them all at once. The question was not just how they died. The question was what they were doing there in the first place. And to answer that, we need to understand the world these men lived in, a world on the edge of collapse. By the middle of the 3rd century AD, the Roman Empire was fracturing under the weight of its own ambitions. The decades between 235 and 284 AD are known to historians as the crisis of the Third Empire, a period of civil war, plague, economic collapse, and military pressure from every direction. Emperors rose and fell with terrifying speed. Some lasted months, some lasted weeks. On the eastern frontier, a new power had emerged that Rome could no longer dismiss. The Sassanid Persian Empire, founded in 224 AD, was not the weak, fragmented kingdom that Rome had dominated for generations. The Sassanids were ambitious, militarily sophisticated, and determined to reclaim the territory they believed was rightfully theirs. Their king, Shapur I, would become one of the most formidable opponents Rome ever faced. A ruler who would eventually capture a Roman emperor alive, the only time in Roman history that would ever happen. Dura-Europos sat directly in the path of this collision. The city had been a Roman garrison town for over a century, a fortified outpost on the eastern edge of the empire, sitting on a limestone plateau above the Euphrates. It was home to a mixed population of soldiers, merchants, and civilians from across the Roman world. Archaeologists have found evidence of Roman legionaries, Syrian archers, Palmyrene cavalry, and communities of Jews, Christians, and followers of Mithras, all living within the same walls. When the Sassanid army appeared on the horizon in 256 AD, the soldiers of Dura-Europos knew they were in serious trouble. The nearest Roman reinforcements were far away. The city's walls were strong, but Shapur's engineers were experienced. The garrison prepared for a siege that everyone understood might be their last. The Persian army that arrived at the walls of Dura-Europos in 256 AD was not a disorganized horde. Shapur, I commanded a professional military force with centuries of siege warfare experience drawn from Persian, Parthian, and Mesopotamian traditions. They brought with them the full arsenal of ancient siege technology, towers, battering rams, and the engineering knowledge to use them effectively. The most significant structure the Persians built was a massive siege ramp on the western side of the city. Using earth, rubble, captured materials, their engineers constructed a slope designed to carry troops and equipment up and over the Roman walls. It was a labour-intensive but proven method, and the Romans inside the city understood exactly what it meant. Once that ramp reached the top of the wall, the city would fall. Rome's response was equally calculated. Rather than simply waiting behind their walls, the garrison's engineers began digging. They excavated a series of tunnels beneath the base of the wall. What ancient military manuals called mines, designed to intercept the Persian ramp before it could reach its full height. The idea was to collapse the ground beneath the ramp, destroying the Persian construction effort from below. It was the ancient world's equivalent of counter-engineering, and both sides practiced it with considerable skill. What emerged was a subterranean war happening simultaneously with the siege above. Two teams of engineers, Roman and Persian, digging toward each other in total darkness beneath the desert floor, navigating by sound and vibration, knowing that somewhere in the earth ahead, the enemy was doing exactly the same thing. The tunnels they left behind tell a story that archaeologists are still working to fully understand. A story of ingenuity, desperation, and a technology that the ancient world was not supposed to possess. To understand what happened in those tunnels, you need to understand what tunnel warfare actually looked like in the ancient world. It was not the romanticized image of soldiers marching through wide underground passages. It was brutal, claustrophobic, and extraordinarily dangerous even before anyone tried to kill you. Ancient mining for military purposes. The technical term is countermining. Required teams of men to excavate narrow passages through hard ground using iron picks, wooden props, and sheer physical endurance. The tunnels at Dura-Europos were typically less than a metre wide and slightly more than a metre tall. A grown man could not stand. He could not turn around easily. The air grew thinner the deeper you went, and the only light came from small oil lamps that consumed whatever oxygen remained. Archaeological analysis of the tunnel system at Dura-Europos revealed something that changed the way historians think about this battle. The Persian and Roman tunnel systems had intersected. In at least one location, the two excavations had broken through into each other, creating a junction point where soldiers from both sides had come face to face in absolute darkness, armed with whatever they could bring into a space barely large enough to crawl. The physical evidence left in the tunnels included the remains of weapons, armour fragments, and the bones of the men themselves. Roman soldiers equipped for underground fighting carried shorter weapons, daggers rather than the longer gladius, because a full sword swing was physically impossible in that space. The Persians, excavating from the other direction, had planned their approach carefully. The geometry of the tunnels, analysed by archaeologist Simon James of the University of Leicester, suggested that the Persian approach was not accidental. They had engineered their tunnel to intersect the Roman one at a precise location, and they had brought something with them that the Romans were completely unprepared for. The discovery that changed everything came not from bones or weapons, but from a careful chemical analysis of the soil and residue within the tunnels. Researchers identified traces of bitumen and sulfur crystals at the intersection point where the Roman soldiers died. These were not random materials. In the ancient world, bitumen, a naturally occurring tar-like substance, found abundantly in the region, and sulfur were both well known for their flammable and toxic properties. The hypothesis, developed in detail by Simon James and supported by subsequent analysis, is this. When the Persian tunnel broke through into the Roman countermine, the Persian engineers did not immediately engage the Roman soldiers in hand-to-hand combat. Instead, they ignited a mixture of bitumen and sulfur in the confined space of the tunnel junction. The burning of these two substances produces sulfur dioxide gas, the same compound that causes suffocation and chemical burns to the respiratory tract, and which, in sufficient concentration in an enclosed space, is lethal within seconds. The Persians, positioned upwind and likely with some form of basic respiratory protection, or simply staying behind the fire, would have pumped the toxic smoke forward into the Roman-occupied section of the tunnel using bellows or the natural draft created by the tunnel geometry itself. The Romans in front of the fire had nowhere to go. The tunnel behind them was too narrow for a rapid retreat. The gas moved faster than they could. Based on experimental reconstructions and analysis of ancient sources, including references in texts by the Roman writer Aeneas Tacticus, this approach was theoretically within the technological capability of the ancient world. Sulfur fires had been used in siege contexts before, but the deliberate deployment of toxic smoke in a confined underground space, designed specifically to kill the occupants rather than simply create light or drive them back, represents something qualitatively different. It represents a weapon designed around the chemistry of death. The archaeological record of the final moments of those Roman soldiers is remarkably precise in the grim way that well-preserved disaster sites always are. The 19 skeletal remains found in the tunnel were not scattered randomly. They were stacked, arranged in a compressed pile near the junction point, in a configuration that Simon James described as consistent with men who had collapsed forward, one on top of another, in rapid succession. Sulfur dioxide poisoning at high concentrations does not give its victims time to run. The gas reacts immediately with the moisture in the eyes and respiratory tract, causing severe irritation and, at sufficient concentration, chemical burns that prevent the lungs from functioning. Consciousness is lost quickly. The transition from healthy to incapacitated to dead can take less than a minute in a space with no ventilation and no escape route. The position of the bones suggested the soldiers at the front of the group died first and fell, and the men behind them, unable to see in the darkness, unable to understand what was happening, stumbled forward into the same lethal concentration of gas and fell on top of them. The Persian soldier found among the Roman dead may have been a combatant who entered too quickly after the gas dispersed, or someone caught at the edge of the tunnel junction during the initial deployment. What the archaeologists found was not a battle scene. It was the aftermath of a trap. The Romans had entered the tunnel expecting to fight with iron weapons in a space where their training and equipment gave them a fighting chance. Instead, they died from something they could not see, could not fight, and had no cultural or tactical framework to anticipate. The gap between what they expected and what killed them is the distance between the military thinking of their era and something that would not be systematically developed again for another 16 centuries. When Simon James published his analysis of the Dura-Europos tunnel in 2009, the response from the academic community was a mixture of fascination and scholarly caution. The evidence was compelling. The chemical residues, the geometry of the tunnel, the position of the bodies, the ancient textual references to sulfur as a weapon, but it was also inferential. No ancient source explicitly described the Persian use of chemical agents at Dura-Europos. The case was built from physical evidence, interpreted through the lens of what was chemically and technologically possible at the time. Some historians raised objections. The sulfur residue might have come from lamps used for illumination. The body positions might reflect panic and collapse from other causes. The presence of the Persian individual among the Roman dead might indicate a place, the key conventional fight that simply ended very quickly. These are legitimate scientific reservations, and they are part of why the Dura-Europos chemical warfare hypothesis remains a hypothesis rather than a settled conclusion. But modern forensic analysis has continued to support James's interpretation. The concentration and location of the sulfur and bitumen residue is inconsistent with lamp oil deposits. The speed implied by the body positions is inconsistent with deaths from conventional combat wounds, none of which were found on the skeletal remains in significant numbers. The deliberate intersection of the Persian tunnel with the Roman one, analysed through careful mapping of the entire underground complex, does not look like an accident. It looks like a plan. The scientific consensus, to the extent one exists, is that the Dura-Europos evidence represents the strongest archaeological case yet identified for the intentional use of chemical agents as a weapon in the ancient world, and possibly in all of recorded history prior to the late 19th century. To fully appreciate what the Sassanid Persians appear to have done at Dura-Europos, it helps to understand just how sophisticated their military was by the standards of the ancient world. The Sassanid Empire was not a frontier kingdom improvising as it went. It was the inheritor of Persian military tradition stretching back to the Achaemenid Empire, updated with centuries of contact and conflict with Rome, the Parthians, and the civilizations of Central Asia. Sassanid siege engineering was among the most advanced of its era. They used systematic approaches to wall demolition, employed specialists in ramp construction and undermining, and maintained the kind of organizational infrastructure required to feed and supply large armies in the field for extended campaigns. Their cavalry, particularly the heavily armoured cataphracts, was renowned across the ancient world, but it was their adaptability, the willingness to combine different military traditions and technologies, that made them genuinely dangerous. The use of bitumen in military contexts had Mesopotamian precedents stretching back to much earlier civilizations. The region around the Euphrates is naturally rich in petroleum seeps, and the flammable properties of bitumen were well understood. Sulfur, meanwhile, had been used in incendiary mixtures in the Greek world at least since the Peloponnesian War of the 5th century BC, when Spartans used burning mixtures containing sulfur against Athenian fortifications. The Persians, drawing on both traditions, may have combined these elements into something more purposeful than either ingredient alone. What the tunnel at Dura-Europos represents, if James's interpretation is correct, is the synthesis of existing chemical knowledge into a specifically designed tactical weapon. Not battlefield agent deployed against massed formations, but a precision tool for use in a specific tactical context where its effects would be maximized and the enemy would have no escape. That kind of deliberate tactical thinking is what separates an accident from a weapon. After the tunnels, the siege ended quickly. The Sassanid ramp reached the walls. The Roman garrison, already weakened by the tunnel fighting and isolated from any hope of relief, was overwhelmed. The city of Dura-Europos fell to Shapur I in 256 AD, and what happened next is one of the more remarkable episodes of preservation in the archaeological record. The Persian victors did not simply loot Dura-Europos and move on. They systematically stripped the city of its population, soldiers, civilians, merchants, craftsmen, and relocated them deeper into the Persian Empire, a standard practice of Sassanid resettlement policy. The city was then abandoned, not destroyed in the way that Rome destroyed Carthage, grinding the stones into nothing. Simply emptied and left. With no one to maintain the buildings, the structures began to collapse slowly. Sand from the desert plateau above began to drift in, filling rooms and corridors. The dry Syrian climate, cold winters, hot summers, almost no rain prevented the organic decay that destroys most ancient sites. Within a few generations, the city was buried. And in being buried, it was preserved with a completeness that has no equivalent outside of Pompeii. When the Yale French excavations began in the 20th century, they found frescoes that had not seen daylight for 16 centuries, their colours still vivid. They found documents, leather equipment, wooden objects, textiles, materials that would have rotted away anywhere with more moisture. They found the tunnel system, the siege ramp, and the 20 soldiers preserved by the same desert air that had buried them. Dura-Europos endured precisely because no one cared about it for so long. Its abandonment was its salvation and ours. The story of what happened beneath the walls of Dura-Europos in 256 AD forces a reassessment of something we tend to think of as modern chemical warfare. The deliberate use of toxic chemical agents to kill human beings is almost universally understood as a phenomenon of the 20th century, beginning with the chlorine gas attacks at Ypres in 1915, and reaching its most systematic expression in the trenches of the Western Front. The chemical weapons conventions of the modern era, the international prohibitions and the moral revulsion that accompanies their violation are all framed around that 20th century origin story. But the evidence from Dura-Europos suggests the conceptual origin is much older. The specific tactical logic, confine your enemy, remove their ability to retreat, introduce a toxic agent into the confined space, is not a product of industrial chemistry or 20th century military doctrine. It is a product of human ingenuity, applied to the problem of killing efficiently in a situation where conventional weapons are at a disadvantage. That logic was available to any sufficiently creative military engineer in any era, provided they had access to the right materials. The Sassanid Persians had access, and they used it. What this means for our understanding of ancient military science is significant. The gap between ancient and modern military technology is real but narrower than popular history suggests. The ancients did not have explosives or firearms, but they had chemistry, they had engineering, and they had the same fundamental drive to find asymmetric advantages over a better armed or better positioned enemy. The tunnel at Dura-Europos is evidence that at least some ancient commanders were thinking about warfare in terms that would not be out of place in a modern military manual. The soldiers who died in that tunnel did not die in the way soldiers of their era were supposed to die. They died from something they had no name for, no defences against, and no way to anticipate. Their bones, arranged in that narrow passage beneath the Syrian desert for 16 centuries, carry a message that historians are still learning to read. War has never been as primitive as we would like to believe, and human ingenuity, applied to the problem of killing, has always found a way forward, regardless of the era, regardless of the technology available, and regardless of the moral weight that comes with crossing lines that most people believe have only recently been drawn.